Right now, as you're watching this, the United States is conducting the most dangerous economic experiment in nearly a century.
Economic experiment with international tariffs.
It'll be a good lesson for all of us.
President Trump declaring tariffs between 10% to up to 50% in some cases.
And here's the thing that should terrify you. We've done this exact experiment before, in 1930. And it helped create the worst economic collapse in American history. And before you click away thinking this is some boring economics lesson, understand this. What's happening right now with American trade policy is not normal.
Mr. President, Donald Trump is ruining the economy on purpose.
The average US tariff rate has exploded from 2.4% in early January of 2025 to over 18%. Levels we haven't seen since the Great Depression. But this isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. This is about your job, your grocery bill, the price of your car, your mortgage payments, and whether your children will inherit an economy that works or one that's being broken by the same mistakes we made nearly a century ago. History shows us exactly how this story ends. Before we dive into what's happening today, we need to understand something fundamental about trade wars. They're not really about trade. They're about power, fear, and belief that economics is a zero-sum game where someone has to lose for you to win. Think of tariffs as economic warfare disguised as domestic policy. When a country imposes tariffs, it's essentially saying we're going to tax our own people for buying foreign products to protect domestic industries. The theory sounds reasonable. Make foreign goods more expensive, domestic goods become more competitive, domestic industries grow, and jobs are created. Problem solved, right? Well, wrong. Catastrophically wrong. See, America has run this exact experiment before, multiple times actually, and every single time it has ended in economic disaster. But somehow we keep forgetting the lessons, convinced that this time it's going to be different, that we're smarter now, that we can control the variables better. The reality is that tariffs are like economic chemotherapy. The theory is that you can poison the foreign competition without killing the domestic patient. But just like chemotherapy, the treatment often proves more destructive than the disease. Today I'm going to show you why what's happening right now might be the most dangerous version of this experiment we've ever attempted. Because unlike 1930, we're doing this with the full knowledge of the consequences, with a global economy that's infinitely more complex and interconnected, and with political leaders who seem determined to ignore every lesson history has taught us. Let me take you back to June 17th, 1930. President Herbert Hoover is sitting in the Oval Office with a pen in his hand, about to sign what would become known as the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Outside, America is already sliding into what would become known as the Great Depression. The stock market had crashed 8 months earlier. Unemployment was rising, and farmers were struggling with falling crop prices. This wasn't supposed to be a big deal. It started as a modest bill to help struggling farmers by raising tariffs on agricultural imports. Senator Reed Smoot of Utah and Representative Willis Hawley of Oregon sponsored what they saw as targeted relief for American agriculture. But Washington works in mysterious ways, which is a topic for a whole other video. By the time the bill reached Hoover's desk, it had metastasized into something monstrous. Lobbyists from every industry had descended on Congress, each demanding protection for their particular sector. What started as farm relief became a comprehensive assault on international trade, raising tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods, everything from buttons to steel to chemicals to textiles. For products already facing tariffs, the law raised the average import tax from 40% to nearly 60%, making for an increase of roughly 20 percentage points. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act raised around 900 import tariffs by an average of 40 to 60%. To put this in perspective, it would be like going to the store today and finding that everything imported, your coffee, your clothes, your electronics, your car parts, suddenly cost 50% more overnight. Now, here's where it gets interesting and absolutely terrifying. Over 1,000 economists signed a letter begging Hoover not to sign this bill. They knew what was coming. They understood the economic principles at stake, and they warned that higher tariffs would raise the cost of living for all Americans, reduce American exports as other countries retaliated, and it would make it harder for foreign countries to pay their debts to American investors, which would damage America's reputation with its allies. It would also worsen the economic crisis that was already underway. But Hoover signed it anyways. Why? Politics, party pressure, the false promise that protection equals prosperity. And then the dominoes started falling. exactly as the economists had predicted. Canada, America's most loyal trading partner at the time, retaliated immediately. Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King, who has way too many names, had actually been contemplating reducing Canadian tariffs. But he was forced by political pressure to impose tariffs on 16 products that represented about 30% of US exports to Canada. But Canada was just the beginning. France, Spain, Italy, and Switzerland increased tariffs on American cars, effectively closing off those markets to major American exports. Britain developed new trade partners. Germany created a complex system of trade clearing that excluded American goods. Argentina, Australia, Cuba, and Mexico all joined the retaliation. Within 2 years, some 24 countries had adopted similar beggar thy neighbor duties. The phrase beggar thy neighbor is important here. It describes the policies designed to help your own country at the expense of others, which ultimately hurts everyone, including yourself. The results were catastrophic beyond anyone's worst predictions. US imports decreased 66% from $4.4 billion in 1929 to $1.5 billion in 1933. US exports decreased 61% from $5.4 billion to $2.1 billion over the same period. US exports to Europe specifically decreased from $2.3 billion in 1929 to just $784 million in 1932. A 66% collapse. Overall, world trade decreased by 66% between 1929 and 1934. American exports to retaliating nations fell by 28 to 32%. Even nations that just protested Smoot-Hawley reduced their US imports by 15 to 23%. But the human cost was even more devastating. Unemployment was 8% in 1930 when Smoot-Hawley was passed, but it jumped to 16% in 1931, eventually reaching 25% by 1933. That's 1 in 4 Americans out of work. More than 5,000 banks failed, hundreds of thousands were homeless, living in shantytowns called Hoovervilles, named after the president who signed the disastrous tariff bill. The tariff didn't cause the Great Depression. That was already underway due to financial instability, poor banking practices, and monetary policy mistakes. But Smoot-Hawley took a serious recession and turned it into a global catastrophe. It transformed a manageable economic downturn into the worst economic crisis in modern history. But here's what's truly chilling. Douglas Irwin, a professor of economics at Dartmouth College and author of Peddling Protectionism, Smoot-Hawley, and the Great Depression, tells us that a whole generation of Republicans and Democrats after World War II was very much conditioned against tariff hikes because of the experience of the 1930s. Now, we have a new generation of leaders who are much more willing to pull the trigger on higher tariffs. In other words, the people who lived through the disaster knew better. But now those people are gone, and we're repeating their mistakes. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but that was 1930. Surely we learned our lesson, right? Surely we wouldn't be stupid enough to try this again. Well, before I give you the answer to that question, let me take a moment to talk about our sponsor for this video. You'd probably be surprised how many people have their identities and personal information stolen. I've run a financial company for the last 22 years, and we run across hundreds of people who have found themselves in this situation annually. What happens is data brokers gather personal information about people and sell it for profit. Unfortunately, this same personal data can also end up in the hands of scammers and fraudsters. And more often than not, it does. Not only that, these same data brokers are often responsible for the annoying calls and emails you receive all the time, trying to sell you stuff and in some cases to even steal more of your information. I've personally spent years trying to scrape my personal phone number and email from the internet. Yet somehow data brokers keep finding it and selling it to more and more companies. Incogni reaches out to these data brokers on your behalf. They request that they remove any of your personal data, and they handle any of the objections. The process to get started is simple. It literally took me less than 5 minutes. That was 5 minutes invested for complete peace of mind when it comes to my personal data. Then all you do is kick back and let them do all the work. So if you want to take your personal data back with Incogni, go to incogni.com/Nolan or use the code Nolan at checkout and get 60% off the annual plan. It will be the best investment you make this year. So the question was, surely we wouldn't be stupid enough to try this again. Well, wrong. Dead wrong. Let me show you the pattern because American history is littered with the wreckage of tariff experiments. Since 1790, US tariff policy has alternated between revenue-driven and restrictionist phases, and each spike historically led to economic deterioration, not recovery. Take the Fordney-McCumber tariff of 1922. It was among the most punitive protectionist tariffs passed in the country's history, raising the average import tax to about 40%. The justification, it was familiar. protect American industry, create American jobs, make America strong, maybe even great again. The result was totally predictable. Retaliation from European governments, higher prices for American consumers, and economic distortions that set the stage for the later Smoot-Hawley disaster. Or consider the tariff of 1828, known as the Tariff of Abominations. It set a 38% tax on some imported goods and a 45% tax on certain imported raw materials. The southern states, which relied heavily on trade, were devastated. South Carolina actually tried to nullify the federal tariff law, creating a constitutional crisis that foreshadowed the Civil War. Fast forward to more recent times. George W. Bush's steel tariffs in 2002 were supposed to boost Americans' struggling steel industry. The tariffs range from 8 to 30% on steel imports. Sounds reasonable, right? Protect American steel workers, strengthen domestic production, reduce dependence on foreign steel. Instead, the tariffs led to the loss of 26,000 jobs in steel-using industries. So while it protected the steel industry itself, it caused massive chaos for the industries that use steel as a product to make their goods. Why? Because higher steel prices made American manufacturers less competitive. Companies that use steel to make cars, appliances, and machinery suddenly found their costs skyrocketing while their foreign competitors enjoyed cheaper inputs. The cure was worse than the disease. The European Union retaliated with tariffs on Florida oranges, American cars, and other products, strategically targeting politically important states. The World Trade Organization ruled against the United States, authorizing over $2 billion in sanctions. Bush was forced to end the tariffs after just 18 months. But significant economic damage had already occurred. While there is some debate about the exact job impact, whether it was actually 26,000, with official government studies showing more modest effects, the consensus among economists is that tariffs created more problems than they solved. Even the seemingly innocuous chicken tax of 1964 created lasting economic distortions. America put a 25% tariff on imported trucks and chickens to retaliate against the European tariffs on American chickens. The chicken tariffs were eventually negotiated away. I mean, just for a second, you can't make this stuff up. We're literally talking about chickens here. But the truck tariffs remained, creating a protected market that lasted for decades and contributed to American automakers becoming complacent about fuel efficiency and innovation. Every single time, the pattern is always the same. Implement tariffs to protect American industries, other countries retaliate with their own tariffs, and trade volumes collapse. American consumers pay higher prices, American exporters lose foreign customers, the protected industries become less competitive, not more, the economy gets worse, not better, and politicians who supported the tariffs get voted out of office. The pattern is so consistent, so predictable, that you'd think we'd have learned by now. But we haven't. And that brings us to 2025. What's happening right now isn't just another trade dispute. This is economic shock therapy on a scale we haven't seen since the 1930s, implemented at a speed that would have been impossible in earlier eras. In 2025, the average US tariff on imports has fluctuated dramatically, starting at 2.4% in early January and reaching as high as 28% during April. The current rate is approximately 18 to 20%, the highest level since the 1930s. But here's what makes this scarier than the 1930s. The speed, the scope, and the interconnectedness of the modern global economy. Let me walk you through what's happened just in 2025, because the pace of change has been breathtaking. On January 20th, Trump takes office with immediate plans for tariff implementation. On February 4th, Trump declares a national emergency over Chinese drug trafficking and uses it to justify a 10% tariff on all Chinese imports. On March 4th, the China tariff is increased to 20%. On March 12th, Trump imposes tariffs on steel, aluminum, and derivative products from all countries. On March 27th, a 25% tariff is imposed on all automobile imports. On April 2nd, the famous, now infamous, Liberation Day, Trump announces sweeping reciprocal tariffs, a 10% baseline on all countries, with dramatically higher rates for major trading partners. 34% on China, 20% on the EU, 25% on South Korea, 24% on Japan, and 32% on Taiwan. On April 5th, the universal 10% tariff takes effect. On April 9th, higher rates for specific countries take effect. From May to July, rates continue escalating. Brazil jumps from 10% to 50%. Canada from 25% to 35%. Switzerland hits 39%. July 27th, after intense negotiations, the EU agrees to a framework limiting their tariffs to 15%. But on August 1st, a new round of tariff adjustments affecting dozens of countries. But here's the truly unprecedented part. Average US tariffs on Chinese exports now stand at 54.9% and cover 100% of all goods. China's retaliatory tariffs on the US exports are at 32.6% and also cover 100% of all goods. US tariffs have risen by 34.2 percentage points. To understand how extreme this is, consider that the last time America had sustained tariff rates this high, Herbert Hoover was the president. Like, who the heck was Herbert Hoover, other than the guy who has a dam named after him? The Great Depression was raging and global trade collapsed by 2/3. We're now in uncharted territory. This isn't just history repeating, it's history on steroids. Implemented with 21st century speed in a 21st century economy where supply chains span continents and a disruption in one country can shut down production in dozens of others. The scale is staggering. Based on 2024 import values alone, the current tariffs affect approximately 2.3 trillion of US goods imported. Or in other words, 71% of all US goods that are imported from other countries at least. We're not talking about protecting a few industries anymore. We're talking about fundamentally restructuring the entire American economy's relationship with the world. And unlike in the 1930s, when this happened gradually over months and years, the 2025 tariff experiment has been implemented in a matter of weeks and months, giving businesses and consumers no time to adjust, no time to find alternatives, no time to prepare for the economic shock. So what happens when you run the 1930 experiment with 2025 technology and global supply chains? Well, we're about to find out in real time, and it's not pretty. Let's start with the stock market, which has been convulsing like a patient in economic shock therapy. Just recently, US stocks were battered by a massive sell-off as Wall Street reckoned with Trump's escalating tariff regime. The Dow Jones lost over 500 points in a single day. The market volatility index spiked to levels not seen since the early days of the pandemic. Investors are essentially saying, we've seen this movie before and we know how it ends. But let's talk about what this means for regular Americans, because the abstract numbers hide very real human costs. The budget lab at Yale estimates that current 2025 tariffs raise consumer prices by 1.8% in the short run. That's a loss of purchasing power of approximately $2,300 per household on average. But that's just the average. For the lowest income families, the burden is much heavier, about $1,200 per year. For families barely making ends meet, that's groceries, gas money, school supplies for their kids. Let's get specific about what this means when you go shopping. Apparel prices are rising 38% from current tariffs. That $50 shirt now costs $69. Those $100 shoes now cost $140. If you have kids who are growing out of their clothes every year, you're looking at hundreds of dollars in additional costs. Food prices are up 3.3% in the short run. But fresh produce, it's up 7%. That's real money coming out of family grocery budgets, hitting hardest on the families who can least afford it. Motor vehicles face some of the steepest increases. Current estimates show motor vehicle prices rising 12 to 14% in the short run, equivalent to an additional $5,800 to $6,800 on the price of an average new vehicle. If you're planning to buy a $30,000 car, you're now looking at $36,000 to $37,000. That's a mortgage payment. That's a year of college tuition. But the consumer impact is just the beginning. Let's talk about what's happening to American businesses, because they're caught in an impossible squeeze. Businesses' pricing power is just getting a little weakened because consumer spending is starting to soften. According to Wells Fargo, translation, businesses desperately want to raise prices because of tariffs, but consumers are tapped out. They can't afford higher prices, but businesses can't absorb the tariff costs forever. And the retaliation, it's swift, it's strategic, and it's devastating. China didn't just sit back and take the punishment. They retaliated with tariffs of 15% on coal and liquefied natural gas and 10% on oil and agriculture machinery. In March, they added 10 to 15% tariffs on select U.S. agricultural products. By mid-2025, China's average tariff on U.S. exports reached 32.6% on pretty much everything that they import from the US. The European Union announced a two-phased retaliatory plan targeting $26 billion in US imports. Phase 1 reinstated tariffs on iconic American products like bourbon whiskey, hitting Kentucky distillers who had nothing to do with the Chinese trade policy. Phase 2 would impose tariffs on an additional $18 billion in US industrial and agricultural goods. The human stories behind these statistics are heartbreaking. American farmers who spent decades building relationships with Chinese buyers are watching their markets disappear overnight. Bourbon distilleries are facing 50% tariffs in European markets, and some countries have just stopped buying bourbon completely. Tech companies are scrambling to find alternatives to Chinese components, often at dramatically higher costs. Meanwhile, the federal government is collecting record tariff revenue. Over $150 billion so far in 2025, a 78% increase from the same period last year. But here's the thing. Politicians don't want you to understand. This isn't free money. Every dollar of tariff revenue represents higher costs that American businesses and consumers are paying. It's not China writing checks to the US. It's American importers paying the bill, and they're passing those costs on to you. Now, you might be wondering, if this is such a terrible idea, why do smart people keep trying it? The answer is actually pretty simple. It feels like it should work, especially to politicians who don't understand how modern economics actually function. The logic seems sound. Tax foreign goods, make domestic goods more competitive, create American jobs, achieve energy independence, make America great again. It's a compelling narrative that appeals to our instincts about fairness and self-reliance. But economics isn't that simple, especially in 2025. Here's what makes the 2025 experiment exponentially more dangerous than anything we attempted in 1930. First, modern supply chains are impossibly complex. When Henry Ford was building cars in the 1930s, most of the parts came from within a few hundred miles of Detroit. Today, a single iPhone contains components from dozens of countries. An American car might have its engine made in Mexico, its transmission made in Germany, its electronics made in China, and its steel made in South Korea, all assembled in a plant in Alabama. This means that tariffs don't just affect final consumer goods. They affect the cost of producing everything. Federal Reserve economists estimate that if an across-the-board 25% tariff is fully passed through to finished goods, investment goods prices rise 9.5% compared with just 2.2% for consumer prices. That means the tools, machinery, and equipment American businesses need to compete just got massively more expensive. Second, the speed of the retaliation is unprecedented. In 1930, it took months for countries to coordinate their responses. Today, China can announce retaliatory tariffs within hours, and they can target specific American industries with surgical precision. They know that bourbon comes from Kentucky, a Republican state. They know that soybeans come from Iowa, a swing state. They know that tech components come from California, a Democratic state. Modern retaliation isn't random. It's political warfare designed to create maximum domestic pressure on American politicians. Third, the financial markets are infinitely more complex and interconnected. In 1930, if a bank failed in Kansas, it might take weeks for the effects to reach New York. Today, if a major company announces supply chain disruptions due to tariffs, algorithmic trading systems can trigger global sell-offs within milliseconds. Market volatility feeds on itself, creating cascading effects that can turn a trade dispute into a financial crisis overnight. Fourth, American consumers and businesses have evolved their dependence on imports, though the relationship is complex. What mitigated Smoot-Hawley's impact in 1930 was that only about a third of total imports were subject to duties, and those dutiable imports represented only 1.4% of GDP. Today, the tariff-affected goods represent a much larger share of economic activity, with current tariffs affecting approximately 71% of all U.S. goods imports by value. 2/3 of household furniture and a significant portion of other household items are imported, creating massive exposure to tariff fluctuations. Recent data shows household furnishings and operations have seen notable price increases throughout 2025. Let me give you a concrete example of how this plays out. On March 27th, the United States imposed a 25% tariff on all car imports, significantly affecting Germany, the world's largest automobile exporter. But here's the thing. Even American car companies are getting hurt because they rely on imported parts. An American pickup truck might have 40% of its components imported. So the tariff meant to protect American auto workers actually makes American-built cars more expensive and less competitive. Motor vehicle prices are estimated to rise 12 to 14% in the short run, equivalent to an additional $5,800 to $6,800 on the price of a new car. For American families already struggling with high housing costs and stagnant wages, this represents a devastating blow to their purchasing power. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell has specifically noted that PCs and AV equipment have become more expensive because of Trump's trade war. The computer you're watching this on probably costs more than it did 6 months ago, and the price is only going to go up. Fifth, the global economy is more fragile. In 1930, most countries were relatively self-sufficient in basic goods. Today, global just-in-time supply chains mean that a disruption in one country can cascade across the world within days. The tariff experiment isn't happening in isolation. It's happening during a period of global economic uncertainty, high debt levels, and geopolitical tensions that make the system far more vulnerable to shocks. But the 2025 experiment isn't just hurting America. It's systematically breaking the entire global economy, country by country, industry by industry, family by family. JP Morgan economists have downgraded their global economic forecast specifically because of the American tariff policy. Global real GDP growth is expected to be just 1.4% in the fourth quarter of 2025, down from 2.1% at the start of the year. That might sound like a small difference, but in economic terms, it represents trillions of dollars in lost output and millions of lost jobs worldwide. Let's look at the damage country by country. In Brazil, Trump imposed 50% tariffs on Brazilian exports. Even though Brazil's exports to the US account for less than 2% of its GDP, and the countries have roughly balanced trade. And the question is, why target Brazil? Well, it's a political grievance over the treatment of the former Brazilian president. Economic policy is literally being driven by personal political vendettas. Then let's look at Europe. Economic activity has been running at an annualized rate of just 0.9% in the first half of 2025, and economists expect it to moderate further in the second half because of the tariffs. European stocks have pulled back significantly, with the Pan-European Stoxx 600 trading at levels not seen since early July. Canada, perhaps the most tragic case because Canada has historically been America's closest trading partner and ally. Well, Canada's long-run economy is projected to be 2% smaller in real terms due to both US tariffs and Canadian retaliation. This is a self-inflicted wound on one of America's most important relationships. Then look at Southeast Asia. Economies like Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia are among the most heavily affected as supply chains scramble to find alternatives to Chinese production. These countries are being whipsawed by trade policies they had no role in creating. And it gets worse because economists have run sophisticated computer models to estimate the full global impact, and the results are catastrophic. Using multi-country economic models that account for complex supply chain interactions, they estimate that US welfare declines by around 2% under current conditions, and nearly double that if full retaliation occurs. That's not an abstract number. That's your standard of living getting measurably worse because of policy choice. That's retirement savings losing value. That's college tuition becoming less affordable. That's the American dream getting further out of reach for millions of families. And we're doing this to ourselves. Unlike natural disasters or pandemics, this is entirely self-inflicted. We're conducting a massive economic experiment on ourselves and our allies, with our own prosperity as the stakes. The cruelest irony is that the tariffs aren't even achieving their stated goals. They're supposed to reduce America's trade deficit, but basic economics tells us that they won't. They're supposed to bring manufacturing jobs back to America, but higher input costs are making American manufacturers less competitive, not more competitive. They're supposed to make America stronger, but they're isolating us from our allies and making our economy more vulnerable, not less. So if we're living through this economic experiment, whether we like it or not, what should you be watching for? What are the warning signs that this is about to get much worse? Well, first, track the average tariff rate. The rate has fluctuated dramatically from 2.4% in early January to as high as 28% during April. Currently, it sits around 18 to 20%. If sustained rates consistently exceed 25%, we're in unprecedented modern territory that could trigger a global recession. Just think 2008, only worse. Watch inflation in goods. Goldman Sachs economists expect that eventually about 70% of the direct cost of tariffs will be passed on to consumers through higher prices. Current data shows specific goods inflation is already occurring, with household furnishings and operations seeing notable year-to-date increases. If core goods inflation start accelerating rapidly, it means businesses are losing their ability to absorb tariff costs. And monitor retaliation. As of recent counts, China, Canada, and the European Union have announced retaliatory tariffs affecting $330 billion of US exports. Every new round of retaliation means the experiment is failing and the economic damage is spreading. Track employment and GDP. Recent data shows GDP contracted 0.5% in Q1 2025 due to tariff-related trade disruptions, though Q2 rebounded to 3% growth as businesses rushed to import goods before the tariffs hit. Employment data showed only 73,000 jobs added in July, far below expectations. If employment growth consistently disappoints, it means the tariffs are destroying more jobs than they're creating. Then watch currency markets. If the dollar strengthens too much, it makes American exports even less competitive. If it weakens too much, it makes imports more expensive and feeds inflation even more. Currency instability is a sign that markets are losing confidence in American economic policy. You can also look at bank stress. Rising interest rates, economic uncertainty, and trade disruptions create stress in the banking system. In the 1930s, tariff-induced agricultural distress led to thousands of bank failures, particularly in rural areas. Watch for signs of stress in regional banks, especially those exposed to agricultural or export-dependent industries. For you personally, here's what you need to do. Diversify your investments. Trade wars create winners and losers, and you don't want to be caught on the wrong side. Consider major purchases now. Prices are only going up, especially for imported goods. Build an emergency savings. Economic experiments create economic uncertainty. Watch your job sector. If you work in exports, import-dependent industries, or global supply chains, have a backup plan. Contact your representatives. Congress gave the president tariff authority after Smoot-Hawley to fix the mess, but they can take it back to prevent future messes. So here we are, nearly a century after Smoot-Hawley nearly destroyed the global economy. And America is running the exact same experiment, just bigger, faster, and with more devastating potential consequences. The parallels are absolutely chilling. In 1930, well-meaning politicians thought they could protect American farmers and workers with tariffs. In 2025, well-meaning politicians think they can protect American farmers and workers with tariffs. In 1930, economists warned of disaster and were ignored. In 2025, economists are warning of disaster and being ignored. It took until World War II for unemployment to fall below the 1930s levels. The last time we tried this experiment, it took a world war to fix the economy we had broken with our own trade policies. The difference is that in 1930, we stumbled into this disaster mostly by accident. Well-meaning politicians trying to help farmers during a crisis, not fully understanding the global consequences of their actions. In 2025, we're doing it on purpose, with full knowledge of what happened before, with sophisticated economic models showing us exactly what will happen. And we're doing it anyways. The current tariffs amount to an average tax increase of nearly $1,300 per US household. Real GDP growth is 0.8 to 0.9 percentage points lower because of these policies. In the long run, the US economy will be persistently 0.4 to 0.5% smaller, equivalent to approximately $135 billion annually. Additionally, tariff revenue collections have reached record levels, with over $150 billion collected so far in 2025, a 78% increase from the same period last year. But this revenue comes directly from higher costs paid by American businesses and consumers. It's not, no matter what anybody tells you, foreign countries paying America. It's Americans paying their own government for the privilege of buying foreign goods. This experiment has real costs, real victims, and real consequences that will rip through the American economy for years to come. Small businesses will close, jobs will be lost, families will struggle, and all of it will be preventable, predictable, and completely unnecessary. This isn't a political statement. It's math. It's history. It's economics. And right now, every single day, the experiment continues. The question isn't whether this experiment will end badly. History's already answered that question with devastating clarity. The question is, how much damage will we let it do before we remember the lessons we've already learned? How many businesses will close? How many jobs will be lost? How many families will suffer? How much of our prosperity will be sacrificed before we admit that the experiment has failed? The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was repealed in 1934, but the damage was done. The question for 2025 is, will we be smart enough to end this experiment before it destroys everything our predecessors spent decades building? Or will we stubbornly continue down a path that history tells us leads only to economic ruin. The choice is ours, the consequences are certain, the clock is ticking, and if you want to know what always happens before a financial crisis, make sure you check out this video right here.